lot of CEOs listening in, a question would be, what does that investment look like when you talk about reducing the interference as the goal? Obviously, you as the leader would know all the strengths of individual members of your team, and you're trying to maximize individual performances. Often we talk about things that don't go well in a performance review, right? And so every company has an annual performance review. Every athlete has an annual, it's not even annual, it's daily, weekly performance review, definitely after a big race or a big sporting event. And so in their world, it's a lot more continuous and a lot more impactful because they don't have a lot of opportunities. The runway is shorter, whereas in a corporate world, you may have a longer runway. So if I'm a CEO listening in saying, hey, David, what does that investment look like in my athletes, on my team? Any word of advice for them on that topic?
Yeah, I think there are potentially a couple of big standouts. I think one is, and you've alluded to it there, it's to, if I think internally within an organization, how can you devise and design your more regular without being onerous on those who are administering it and running it, right? This is not about creating a bureaucracy, but this is about creating more checking points, because that, and designing it in a way that incorporates performance as hopefully we are now coming to understand it as being both what you deliver and what might get in the way, right? So design it with both of those aspects in mind so that this becomes a continuous conversation. And it's out there. It's out there for us all to know. And if I think back to our first episode, Rohit, where we were talking about high-performing teams, high-performing teams talk about this kind of stuff as a team. They talk about their own journey to peak performance. Why? Because there's trust in a high-performing team, as we talked a lot about last time. And because of that, you can be more vulnerable with one another. You can talk about your own journey to peak performance. And so it becomes something that these two things sit beautifully together, a high-performing team and team members who are on a journey to personal peak performance. So it becomes a language. It becomes part of the culture of the organization, both in conversational terms, but also in process terms, appraisals and reviews and mentoring and coaching, whatever facilities a CEO has in his or her organization. Those processes should be extended so that they can incorporate the types of things that we're talking about. And that's another identifiable trait, for example, of a high-performing organization from a people point of view that is creating peak performing individuals.
It's really, I think if I step back and summarize what you've said so far, is there's a few things. One is programmatically, a CEO should be thinking about both variables, not just the one. Often, if not always, we think about performance, but we don't think about interferences that an individual has. But the thing that you're sort of alluding to is on the interference piece, there are two aspects. One is within and the other one is without, right? So within the human, that there is interference that requires a lot of introspection, self-awareness, and sort of like that takes, but once you start thinking about it, so for those who are thinking about themselves in this conversation, they're like, what are the sources of interferences and when do they manifest? And if they do, to your point, some of the examples of what they could do to minimize it, to understand that it's purely an interference, it's not reality, and so that starts to reduce the interference within. On the outside, you mentioned environments, team, systems, structure, which is both something that an individual can influence, but leadership teams who are building those environments and structure, they're the ones who can create the most impact. So those who are trying to help people reach their peak performance and have access or decision rights on those environments. And that's where your counsel is, that part of it's reviews, but within those reviews include these things. So the conversations had. And I think that's a really good cycle, because I can imagine in the examples you were talking about in the sports world where a team is talking about interference and they're helping the individual, and especially Formula One, where you've got one or two individuals on a team who are driving but there's a massive, massive team around them. Them talking about it creates this really nice, I would imagine, I'm not there, I've never been there, but you have. And so it creates a really nice dynamic, I can imagine, of the person who is trying to improve and looking at their interferences, but the team also saying, how can we be better, but also help him reduce their interference. So that sort of creates a positive loop. Am I extrapolating too much, or is that how it really happens on the Formula One track?
Yeah, that's exactly how it happens. That there's this kind of a chain effect, right? Because we've got this common understanding of what performance is made up of, and we're all on that journey together. It's not just the driver that desires to be at peak performance. It's every member of that team that is striving. And so what better way to do that than to support one another through that common language and that common understanding that you have, rather than us all trying to work on it just individually. Now, there is the individual element, right? And so what I would say to the CEOs and the leaders out there is invest up front. It's quite it's a difficult journey to go on your own, confronting that duck, understanding your fears, admitting them, figuring out why they're there and where they come from, getting clarity on what is the impact that they have on your behavior. When you show up as a diminished version of yourself, what is the impact of that on you, and what is the impact of that on those that are around you, right? That's a very difficult journey to go on your own. So to the leaders out there, I would say, when you think about that part of the journey, invest in people, get a coach, see it as a long-term investment, that the coach doesn't need to be around forever. A good coach shouldn't be around forever, right? But it's important that they can get your people off to a good start, and they can share techniques that allow you to become self-sustaining. But because it's a scary journey for most of us to begin, having that independent advisor, a coach, whatever you call the person, at the beginning of your journey is incredibly important, so that you do actually start the journey, you don't shy away from it, and that you're advised with techniques and tips and tricks that will allow you to become self-sustaining over the medium term. Then you don't need the coach anymore. But to the leaders, you have a role to play in the atmosphere, in the culture that you create for the teams that you lead, and you have a role to play in getting your folks and yourself off to a great start by investing in a bit of external support to get the journey started, safe in the knowledge that if you get a good person to help you with that, they will equip you with the skills to be able to maintain that journey without them.
What are some of for those people who are saying, it's again, I'm playing devil's advocate. Some people say, hey, look, we can get more resources to help, but you've seen the end game here. You've seen what happens when this happens. So are there examples of individuals from whether it's football or Formula One or golf or any other sport or business that you can think of where when the individual or the team, but because we're talking about peak performing individuals, when such an investment was made either by the person or their management, that it was transformative? Any examples that stand out and that you can share with us that sort of bring all of this to light as to, we understand conceptually, but when did that happen, and people can sort of visualize a bit better?
So a couple of examples, I would say, from, let's go back to our Formula One conversation from the first episode. And let me talk to you about Nico Rosberg. And for those that are not familiar with Formula One, Nico was for many years the Mercedes teammate of Lewis Hamilton. And this was during a period when Mercedes were at the top of the sport. They were literally winning drivers and constructors world championships, both back to back to back to back over a number of years. But the driver's title was always going to Lewis. Why was that? Nico had always worked with a mind coach, as he calls them. But I don't think he'd really worked on the interferences in as crystal clear a way as was necessary. And, some of those interferences were to do with the team, right? He had a belief that Lewis was the favoured driver, that Lewis was privy to information that he wasn't, that Lewis was getting upgrades to his car that he wasn't, etc., etc. And it didn't matter whether these things were true or not. These were the things that his dog was telling him. I use those as examples. There was a lot else. So the start of the 2016 season, Nico decided, because he's a smart guy, he was going to throw everything at it that season. And so we started to do some work, particularly on these really deep-seated interferences. And it was the breakthrough. Nothing else changed. He was driving the same car. He had the same dietary coach. He had the same dietary regime. He had the same fitness training. He didn't increase, decrease, didn't change anything else other than a razor focus with a clear goal and target that this was the year that he was going to be the world champion.
Yeah.
At the end of 2016, Nico was the Formula One world champion.
Amazing. Yeah. Yeah.
Now,
that's a really powerful story.
But yes, okay, it's an extreme example from a particular world, from a particular part of the sporting world. And there was a season-long focus and combination of support that propelled him to that. Absolutely, I accept that. But the fundamentals are absolutely transferable to anybody in any walk of life. And I know that because I've done the same kind of work with people in the corporate world who are running businesses. I've done it with emerging leaders. I've done it with new recruits at the graduate level. I've done it with disadvantaged kids in local communities. I've done it with senior and junior politicians. I've done it with teachers in schools. It doesn't matter who you are or the walk of life that you find yourself on.
Yep.
The human condition is the human condition. And working on this will transform you, whoever you are, and wherever in life you find yourself.
Yeah.
But it doesn't just happen, right? It's an investment. It's primarily an investment choice that you make in yourself. And it's an investment choice that you or others on your behalf can make to get you the support to begin the journey that then becomes a self-sustaining.
Yeah. That's really powerful example. And also the fact that all of these facets, these people that you work with, and there's a multiple dimension. And so it doesn't matter what walk of life you're in and what's your environment, by being able to reduce the interference, you can, in fact, my takeaway from this conversation so far is that, perhaps, there is time in life to build that potential and to build your strengths. And I think you've got to do that because early on in your career, you don't have a lot of tools in your toolkit. And so as you're building your toolkit, naturally the human experience, call it that, lends itself to bring in these interferences. And some of us work through some of these interferences, have some success. Others work through a lot of them, have a lot of success, but many don't break through that. And many of them sort of get withheld. And so what you're saying is, whether you want to be a peak performing individual or a high performing individual or a performing individual, you can take your spectrum, the potential's there. Work on, if you've gotten to a point in your life where you're listening to this episode and all of what we're saying actually makes sense already, then you're already at that point where you've achieved a lot of things and all you want to achieve. There's ambition, aspiration, and experience all within you. And so now might be a great time, whether you do it yourself and or with the help of others around you, to get that coach or to get that mentorship to work on reducing that interference. And again, it's not a lifelong investment, to your point, but it is one that if you don't start now, it could take a lifetime to get there.
The more aware you are that is happening to you, the more choice you have to react in a different way next time it happens.
Subscribe to the People Quotient channel, where leadership meets action. Powerful conversations with practical insights that you can use right now. See you in the next episode.